Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 17th of March of 2025. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And this video we're going to start right from the Zaporizhzhia direction, where the Russians began another offensive operation, and as a result of first days of clashes, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. As for the beginning of the 17th of March of 2025, there were several reports that the Russians managed to enter the settlement of Mali Shirbaki and the settlement of Stepova. The Ukrainian sources during the day published the first video where we can see how the Ukrainians were FPV-droning and attacking the positions of the armored force of the Russian Federation of the territory of the settlement by the name of Mali Shirbaki. And in the first half of the day, we have adjusted this part of the territories under complete Russian control. So we had the first and probably very reliable proofs that the Russians, as a result of first 7 or 6 days of offensive operation, managed to take under control at least 50% of the settlement of Mali Shirbaki, probably 10% of the settlement of Shirbaki. Furthermore, during the day we got another very important report that was published by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. The Russians reported that as a result of decisive actions, the forces of the group of forces Dnieper managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Stepova. And based on the report of the Minister of Defense, we have adjusted the map in the Russian favor. So these are the changes on the ground that we've made since the beginning of the 17th of March of 2025. The Russian offensive operation in this area began somewhere on the 12th of March of 2025. This offensive started a bit earlier, but on the 12th of March of 2025, we got the first video how the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish the flag in the northern part of the settlement. And based on this video, we adjusted the map somewhere around 11th and 12th of March of 2025. And after the fall of the settlement of Petykhatki, the Russians continue advancing further in the northern direction, and by the end of the 17th of March, the Russians managed to establish complete control over 3 settlements according to different sources. The Russians captured the village of Stepova, the Russians secured the village of Mali Shirbaki, and the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, established complete control over the village by the name of Shirbaki. So this is the situation by the end of the 17th of March. We see that Ukrainians most likely show fierce resistance, but it is not enough to stop the Russians. And now, of course, the most important question: what is the main purpose, what is the main task of the Russians in this area, what the Russians are planning to achieve by this offensive operation? I know that when summarizing everything, of course, the most obvious target for the Russians is to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Zaporizhzhia. The distance to this city is not so big. The Russians, we can say that the Russians are already on the outskirts of this settlement, and if we calculate the distance, then the distance between the edge positions of the armored forces of the Russian Federation of the territory of Stepova and Zaporizhzhia itself is less than 30 kilometers. And most likely the Russians can try to attack in this area, but if the Russians want to establish complete control over the siege of Zaporizhzhia, they need to have up to 100,000 soldiers. If you ask my opinion, I believe that currently the Russians don't have this amount of forces in the territory of Kherson, Zaporizhzhia and Crimea. 100,000 soldiers that should be introduced immediately, and that you need to know that most likely probably 30 or 40 or even 50% of this number would be destroyed by the Russians, by the Ukrainians during the say defense operation. So, and another important thing, that if the Russians want to take the city of Zaporizhzhia under complete control, of course the best way to do this is to semi-encircle the settlement from the northeast, from the north, from the northwest, from the west and from the southwest. But to do this, the Russians need to carry out something like another Sudzha or another pipeline operation, another operation that's something like the thing we used to see in the area of Sudzha, and we understand that most likely the Russians will not be able to do this for many reasons. even if the Russians are able somehow to move through the settlement of Zaporizhzhia with some reconnaissance operation or some landing operation on significant number of helicopters, most likely the Russians will not be able to hold their lines for a very long period of time without supply and support. And sooner or later, the Ukrainians would be able to break through the Russians, let's say, blockade and to restore control with the siege of Zaporizhzhia. So another option for the Russians is to establish complete control just over the eastern part of the city, just to take under control this part of the city of Zaporizhzhia that is located on the Russian side of the river of Dnipro. But even in this case, the Russians need to begin something like outflank operation with the purpose to cut the city of Zaporizhzhia from supply and support from the north. Basically, somehow the Russians need to cut M18 road. So they need to do something like this probably during the next several months. And furthermore, the Russians need to establish complete control over the city of Orekhov, over the city of Stepnogorsk, Primorsk, and many other towns and villages that are located inside of this red area. So what I'm trying to tell you that I'm not sure that the Russians began offensive operation in the Zaporizhzhia direction with the purpose to complete everything that we've just talked about. First of all, the Russians don't have these resources. They need up to 100,000 soldiers, and obviously the Russians need to begin destroying bridges right now. So they need to destroy bridges right now that will allow the Russians to cut supply and support of the eastern part. The Russians then need to get as close as possible to the city of itself, and then to establish complete FPV drone control over the river of Dnipro, over possible area where the Ukrainians would build pontoon bridges and different crossings. So what does it mean? I'm just trying to tell you that most likely the Russians have completely different purposes in this offensive operation. And more likely the Russians currently are trying just to force the Ukrainians to keep some resources, some reserves in this direction and not to use them somewhere else. And now this is the most important part. So where exactly the Ukrainians have the possibilities right now to use their reserves, on which direction, and what kind of offensive or special operation the Ukrainians may carry out in the very near future, which most likely will not, the Russians will not like. And to understand this situation, to understand this topic and this matter, first of all, we need to go a bit behind and a bit in the next several days. For example, as you know, and according to information we have, tomorrow there are going to be very important talks between the Russian Federation and the United States of America. This information today was confirmed by the press secretary of Putin, by Peskov. Kremlin not disclosing details of upcoming talk between two presidents. President communicates with Frontline fighters daily. Putin to promptly respond to award presentations of Operation Pipeline participant. Voice of America and Radio Liberty are propaganda media, but their closure is the U.S. international affair. Peskov did not comment on Lukashenko's words that Putin allegedly receives calls from Ukraine. So tomorrow is going to be a very important negotiation process between Putin and Trump, and this information was confirmed by the Putin administration and by Trump administration. And most likely tomorrow they're going to be a very tough negotiation process where the parties are going to discuss or summarize everything they managed to achieve probably since the beginning of the Trump's terms. But you know that when talking about this negotiation process, we have already some insights about this. Trump several days ago reported and talked a lot about some questions and some issues regarding this negotiation process. For example, there were lots of statements regarding the Ukraine's memberships in NATO, and according to information we have, Ukraine will not receive it. But the most important issue and the most important question that was raised during all these talks, all this preparation process is a potential agreement on the Black Sea. As for now, I'm not sure, and that I don't understand what exactly these sides are going to talk about. But the most important question that I managed to understand is the question and the issue of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So most likely this is exactly the point, the focal point of the current Russian offensive operation in the Zaporizhzhia direction. So how is that? Zelensky 3 weeks ago, probably more or less 3 or 4 weeks ago, had at least three strong cards, three trump cards. The first card of Zelensky was the territories that the Ukrainian armed forces were controlling in the Kursk region. So if you remember, the Ukrainians controlled the city of Sudzha agglomeration, and many other different towns and cities in this area, and the Ukrainians were trying to hold these territories as long as possible. And according to Zelensky's plans, he was planning to change these territories for some other territories. And now it's obviously that Zelensky was planning to change the Sudzha territories for Energodar, for the city of Energodar, and for the territory of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and around. So that was the plan of Zelensky. That was his first trump card. But now we see that as a result of decisive actions of the group of forces north, the Ukrainians were completely defeated in this area, and the Ukrainians were forced to fall back, and that's how Zelensky and Ukraine itself lost the first trump card. The second trump card of Ukraine is the territory in the northeastern part of Ukraine. We are talking about the northeastern part of the region of Chernihiv and the northern part of the Sumy region. We're talking about these territories. This is the second strongest trump card of Zelensky and Ukraine. Why is that? Because from these territories, the Ukrainians have possibilities to attack deep inside of the territory of Russia, and the distance between this pocket to the heart of Russia, to Moscow, is less than 5 kilometers. Imagine yourself if ever NATO countries will take under control this territory, they will be able to attack deep inside the territory of Russia with Tomahawk, with ATACMS, with nuclear missiles in the direction of Moscow, and obviously this missile will cross this distance probably within seconds, maybe within minutes, but maybe somewhere like in a very short, let's say, period of time. This is the second trump card of Zelensky, but recently Putin stated and told us that he asked the head of Russian army, Valery Gerasimov, to think how to create security territory along the border with the Russian Federation. Most likely Vladimir Putin was talking exactly about this territory. For example, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians, as a result of reconnaissance operation, managed to discover another concentration of the Ukrainian forces, most likely some operators of drones that the Ukrainians were planning to use to attack once again deep inside of Russia. But this time, as a result of Iskander strike, the Russians managed to destroy this group of forces, but obviously this is not the last one. So to close this issue, the Russians need to cut the salient, but when talking about this territory, everybody understands that currently this is probably the strongest card of Zelensky until at least today, until the morning of the 17th of March of 2025. So what happened today? Today, Zelensky revealed his last strong card, his last trump card. So what exactly did happen today? Very simple and very easy. Let's discuss this in details. Today, the parliament of Ukraine adopted very important law. Zelensky signed probably the most important law since the beginning of the special military operation. Now units of the armed forces of Ukraine can be sent to other states during the martial law. As you know, Zelensky extended the last time the martial law, and the current martial law expires in May of 2025. And according to this law was adopted for several purposes: to ensure national security, to deter armed aggression, to protect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine, to exercise the right to self-defense in accordance with Article number 51 of the United Nations Charter. But most of the military experts and most of the political experts think that Zelensky adopted, the Ukraine parliament adopted this law not to attack the territory of the Russian Federation, but to stress and to test the situation around the Transnistria region. So most of the military experts believe that Zelensky adopted this law today on the 17th of March of 2025, right before the negotiation process, right before the call between the President of the United States of America, Trump, and Putin to show them if he doesn't like the results of their negotiation process, Ukraine will use its right to attack the territory of Transnistria with the purpose to take under control these territories. Zelensky is not going to capture these territories. Obviously, the main purpose for him is another media victory to humiliate Putin, to restore territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Moldova, and probably to allow this country, Moldova, to join the European Union, the NATO, and many other different international organizations. And telling the truth, when talking about this operation, Russia most likely will not be able in a very short time to stabilize the situation, to take under control the city of Odessa, Nikolaev, or Kherson, with the purpose to create some corridor with Transnistria and the mainland. And something tells me that if the Russians decide ever to carry out this operation, they will have to have much more forces than just 100,000 soldiers. They're gonna have much more forces, and they will face the significant probably pressure from the Western countries, from the European countries, and most likely if the Russians begin this operation, most likely the Western countries will introduce their forces on the territory of Ukraine. So now the situation is very difficult. But the thing is that Zelensky is not going to attack. If he wanted to attack Transnistria, he would not apply this law. He would do the same thing as he used to do on the territory of Kursk. Nothing was applied, nothing like that was applied before the beginning of the Zaporizhzhia offensive operation. The Ukrainians just began this operation, and that's it. So they had rights to do the same in this area, just to receive some permission from Moldova, and that's it. But the thing is that now Zelensky is just trying to show his last trump card. He wants to show Trump, he wants to show Putin that I want Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and if you don't return me back this Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, I will attack Transnistria. So basically, Zelensky, wanted to change the territory of Sudzha for the territory of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, but because I've lost these territories, now I will try to do the same, but with the territories of Transnistria. So this is the plan, and this is the last trump card of Zelensky. And now, when talking about this Zaporizhzhia offensive operation, we understand the main purposes of the Russians. The Ukrainians suffered significant losses in the Sudzha direction, in the Pokrovsk direction, and now the Russians are forced to begin these offensive operations towards the Ukrainian positions just with one purpose: to pin down the Ukrainians and not to allow them to use their reserves for this offensive operation. Because if Ukrainians begin this offensive operation in the area of Transnistria, most likely it's going to be much more easier for the Russians to attack in the direction of Zaporizhzhia, because basically the Ukrainians will not be able to introduce any reserves to stop the Russians. So anyway, when talking about this Zaporizhzhia offensive operation once again in details, as for now it's even very difficult to understand what exactly the Russians are planning to do next, because the Russians indeed managed to capture all these villages, but currently the distance between the edge positions of the armored forces of the Russian Federation and, let's say, the settlement of Novoandreevka is a bit less than 10 kilometers. Under open air, under complete control of Ukrainian drones, and under fire of Ukrainian artillery and Ukrainian FPV drone operators. The next settlement to the north is the village by the name of Pavlovka, but as for this territory, the distance between edge Russian positions and this village itself is also around 7 kilometers that the Russians need to walk through the defense lines, trenches, minefields, and many other fortifications of the armored forces of the Ukraine. Another direction is, of course, the settlement of Kamyanskaya, with the purpose to, let's say, cut and cauldron this village, but for these purposes, trying to outflank this settlement, the Russians are gonna have to cross another 11 kilometers. So I'm just trying to tell you that despite the fact that lots of pro-Russian resources have already announced about the significant victory of the Russians in the Zaporizhzhia direction, that the Russians announced that they managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt, that the Ukrainians are running away from their positions, that the Russians are advancing almost the same way as the Russians were advancing in the area of Sudzha, everything is not so simple, everything is not so easy, and there are lots of things and lots of stones that the Russians will face on their way of offensive operation. Anyway, let's wait and see. Tomorrow is a very important date, but now we understand the final trump card of Zelensky, and obviously he is going to play with Transnistria. But telling the truth, even if the Russians will accept the terms and the conditions of Ukraine to exchange the security of Transnistria for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, it doesn't mean, and it will never mean, that Zelensky will not decide to use this case in the future. So that's why I believe that the Russians currently are trying to win some time and to find a solution how to protect the Transnistria in case if Zelensky decides to cross this red line. Another important thing about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and that the Russians most likely will continue their offensive operation, is that today, according to information we have, the Russian side is no longer ready to agree to the rotation of the IAEA organization observers at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant through the Ukrainian territory. That was stated by the Russians. So you know that the former rotation pass road that Ukrainians, not Ukrainians, but this IAEA organization we're using is the road M18. So this is the part that was under complete responsibility. The security of this road was under the, let's say, responsibilities of the Ukrainians. Somewhere in this part, in this central part of Kamenskaya, the Russian security forces changed the Ukrainians, and then the IAEA organization was moving along the same M18 road almost until the city of Energodar and Zaporizhzhia power station. But the problem is that at the beginning of 2025, there was a very interesting accident that took place, let's say, on the territory that was under complete or is under complete Russian control, in the area of responsibilities of the Russian security organization. This is exactly the video I'm talking about. This situation took place on the 13th of February of 2025, and here we can see how the inspectors of IAEA organization were trying to carry out rotation process. And this video came from the Russian controlled territory, and in this video we can see how somebody was bombing and attacking these cars, this convoy, with the purpose not to allow this rotation process to be finished successfully. And during this process, the IAEA organization decided to stop this mission and to return back to the territories of Ukraine. So as you can see, now we had report that the Ukrainians, not the Ukrainians, but the IAEA organization are not going to use this road anymore. Most likely they will complete the rotation process through the territory of Rostov-on-Don and then through the territory of Crimea, but it doesn't matter. The most important that they're not going to use the Ukrainian part of the road anymore. And this is very important because obviously we understand if this IAEA organization continued using M18 road, most likely the Russians would not have such a possibilities to carry out offensive operation, because the distance between the edge positions of the armored force of Russian Federation and the roads for rotation is less than 7 kilometers. And obviously there were, now there is no such chances, but there were high chances that somebody would attack this organization, which will break and ruin the offensive plan. So that's why this situation, when this organization cancelled this road as the only road for rotation process, also plays in Russian favor, because the Russians can without any problems continue their offensive further in operation in the north or in the city of Orekhov with the purpose to improve their positions, and obviously they will not face any provocation from the Ukrainian side. So this is the situation. I believe that we need to keep an eye on this area, because something huge might happen here if the negotiation process and talks between Russia and United States of America goes the wrong way, the way that Zelensky will not like. So let's see. Anyway, let's continue with the surging direction where the Russians continue their offensive operation. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions, but we see that the Russians currently, it's getting more and more difficult for the Russians to save their tempo, to save their rate of offensive operation. You know that today, for the first time since the beginning of the Russian counter-offensive operation, we haven't received even a single adjustment, even a single change on the map to the west of the city of Sudzha. The battle for the settlement of Gogolevka is already the third day in a row when the Russians try to force the Ukrainians to fall back from the settlement of Gogolevka. The sources are saying that the Russians are about to finish this battle, but obviously when talking about this part, this is the first day when we haven't adjusted the map completely. We're not talking about the changes that were made in the Russian favor because we have some geolocations. We're not even talking about the changes that could be made in the Russian favor, let's say according to different neutral mappers. So we see that this front line stopped completely. We're not saying that the Russians are not going to take or are not able to secure the village of Gogolevka. We're just saying that the Russians are slowing down. Now, for example, during the previous 24 hours, the only changes were got from the settlement of Gueva. The Russian sources first published the video how they managed to establish their flag on the most southern part, and later several neutral mappers reported that as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to secure this territory completely. But as for now, without any proofs, and the most important, neither the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation nor the official channel of the Group of Forces North confirmed this information, which is also a very important signal that something is happening here and it's getting more and more difficult for the Russians to move further. As another thing is very important, maybe the Russians are not going to use it. Anyway, today we got another very important update from this territory. It is noteworthy that against the backdrop of events in the Kursk region, Western sources report the transfer of A-50U flying raiders to the Sumy direction. If these reports are to be believed, at least one or two such machines are already operating in the area on a permanent basis. The appearance of the A-50U may indicate not only increased control over the skies, but also possibly preparations for precision strikes on the most important facilities of the Ukraine armed forces in this area. If the information is confirmed, this will be another signal of a strategic change in the situation in this direction and a possible intensification of hostilities in this sector. But I believe that this ship could appear in this area because France have redeployed lots of Mirages. The Ukrainians use this territory to attack deep inside of Russia with drones, so the Russians need to have better reconnaissance information for better work of their air defense. I believe so. Once again, this is one of the strongest card of Zelensky at this stage of the special military operation. As for the other directions, the Russians continue their offensive operation, but as for now, the most important updates are coming from the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians, according to different sources, entered the southern part of the settlement of Veselaya. There are very heavy clashes there. Most important updates are coming from the city of Chasiv Yar. If you can see, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians published tens different geolocations and videos from this territory, which confirms that most likely some reinforcements and reserves have been redeployed back from the Suji direction, and now the Russians have possibilities to intensify their activities with the purpose to attack the city of Konstantinovka. And probably the next important updates are coming from the northern Kupiansk direction, where the Russians are about to begin their final offensive operations toward the settlement of Kamyanka. According to different mappers, the Russians crossed the river of Oskol in few more points, in few more parts, and now about to finish the battle for this territory. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.